Do you suck at braking? Do you always wonder, how can everybody around you go so much faster into a corner? Why are the lap times so much better while you're spinning out of control in the wall crying? Well, in this video, I'm going to be breaking down braking and sharing with you the 5 stages of the brake zone. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Daniel Morad, and I want to share with you the techniques I used to win races like the Rolex 24 Hours at Daytona twice, and many other races in my racing career. Now, you often hear the term brake point or trail brake, but what is that stuff? So I wanted to explain it on a more detailed level and break it down so you can understand easily and take these techniques and immediately work on your braking. The goal is you should be teaching yourself how to brake and understand the vehicle dynamics underneath you. Now, before we get into the video any further, make sure that you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you get notified when I post more videos like this that are going to help you become a better driver. So next thing, we have to jump on the rig. I'm going to show you the fundamentals, the base of what you need to understand braking. And then we're going to get into the 5 points.
Now, it's really important to understand your equipment and to know what's actually happening under your foot and how that translates into your sim. Whenever I jump onto a rig where it's not my equipment, the first thing I do is I'll pull up the iRacing little telemetry bar. Normally, I don't have access to other people's software, and I know that in iRacing, for instance, you have this telemetry bar that you can put up on your screen. So if you use Alt-K, that allows you to move all the things on your screen around. So I'll usually access the driving controls, Alt-K, put it in the middle of my line of sight so that when I'm driving, I can actually see what my inputs are, my throttle, my braking, and my clutch. Also, you can see your steering, but that's not important for this exercise here. You just want to know what your brake is doing. Now, don't be afraid as well when you're setting up your brake to make a softer pedal with longer throw. That typically will allow you to have more range of control and force you to put less effort into the brake pedal. Now, everyone thinks that you need 120 kilograms, 200 kilograms of force on the pedal, but you actually don't. In the GT3 cars that I'm racing, the Mercedes-AMG GT3 and the GT4, it's probably around 50 to 60 kilograms of force, maybe 70 at the most. I've tuned mine to about 58 kilograms of max force, and that's what it will register in game. So I have a lot of range. I have around 70 centimeters of travel on my actual pedal. So a lot of range, not a super stiff pedal. That's going to help me, have a lot of control on the brake. Now, you can use other things like Race Labs or CAPS. There's other programs, third-party programs that you can install, and you can put their telemetry bars up on the screen, which is my preference. And still to this day on the sim, I have the Race Labs Pro telemetry bar. I had that up on my 4th monitor that I have extended out quite long so that when I do a corner, I don't have to stare in the middle of the corner and see what my braking is looking like. I can actually do all my cornering, braking, all that on the following straight. There's enough time where that telemetry is still displaying on the screen where I can go ahead and analyze what I've just done in the corner. So if I'm not getting the correct balance or entry speed into a corner, I can actually just go and quickly review my corner, my braking technique, and really make quick adjustments on the fly. At the end of the day, the most important thing for you to understand is what your brake foot means in the sim. How is the sim interpreting the pressure you're putting on the pedal? Once you understand that, then you'll better understand these next 5 stages of braking, and you'll be able to master braking.
The first stage of the brake zone is finding a brake point. Now, to find a brake point, you just need to understand your car's braking capabilities while in a straight line until your turn-in point. So you can figure that out just by braking a bit earlier, braking at the maximum capability of your car, and seeing how long it takes for your car to slow down. Then you can start to implement that further and further into a corner. So in terms of finding your brake point, take a visual reference If it's a brake marker, that's great. If there aren't any markers and they're too far off the side of the road, you can use any sort of visual reference, maybe a crack on the road, dirt patch. That's really all you have. You can use depth perception to the corner. Sometimes that's your last resort. Don't use shadows. Those move. I've heard people say they've used shadows before. I can tell you it will end in tears. So don't use that. Use any sort of physical stationary marker as your reference point, and always brake off of your visual reference marker. That's the first thing. You need a constant. You need to start off of something that's consistent every single time when you go into a brake zone in order for you to learn how to get the maximum out of the performance of a corner and a brake zone. Stage 2 of the brake zone is a bit more complex now. We're going to talk about the ramp up to peak pressure. Now, this can change based on the type of car you're driving, whether it's a high downforce car or a low downforce car, whether you go through elevation change up over a hill or downhill into a flat compression. That's going to change everything because the contact patch of the tire dictates how quickly you can ramp up to peak pressure. Now, I've spoken about contact patch in other videos I've made, but it is ultimately the most important part of the car. The tire connects your car to the road. And if you don't have the right balance on the tire, or you don't give the tire enough time to squeeze that contact patch across the ground, you're basically losing grip. So you always want to try to put the maximum amount of rubber on the road, especially for where the weight's going. So if the weight's going to be going forward, you need to give the front tires enough time to squish across the surface of the road to give you the maximum amount of grip. So for example, higher downforce car, you have generally at higher speeds, more downforce. So that's pushing the car and the tires downward into the track surface. That's going to expand the tire and the surface area of the tire that's connected to the road. Therefore, you can be a lot more aggressive with your ramp angle on the initial brake hit. So you can really hit the pedal hard and you have the grip available for you. You won't slide, lock up, or go into the anti-lock brake system or ABS. If you have a lower downforce car, so for example, high downforce would be prototypes or single seaters, even GT3 in high downforce configurations can give you lots of grip when you can be aggressive on the brake. But let's say lower downforce, so Mazda MX-5, GT4 cars, things that have less downforce, you need to be a lot slower with the ramp up, how aggressive you peak the brake pedal or the brake pressure. So there's a lot of different factors, but ultimately, if you just keep contact patch of the tire in mind, that will really help give you a good foundation and base for where you need to start with your ramp angle or the attack up to peak pressure. Now, in terms of peak pressure, that is dictated by the grip level available, again, the downforce level of the car, and elevation change. Basically, contact patch of the tire. That will dictate how much peak pressure you can give to the car. Sometimes you fall into a trap where you think you can't brake harder than you are already, but that's just because you may be too aggressive with the ramp up. So if you have a car that, like I said, has less downforce, if you're less aggressive with the ramp up to peak pressure, you might be able to squeeze more out of it and therefore decelerate the car with greater effect. Stage 3 of the brake zone is the brake release point. Now that comes in two different ways. There's something called aero bleed or aerodynamic bleed off, and there's a mechanical bleed off point. So the aero bleed off point would be dictated by the downforce level of the car. If you have high downforce car, single seater, Indy car, F1, prototypes, you'll have something called an aero bleed, and that's basically when the pressure or the downforce level comes off the car as you start going slower through the deceleration zone. You need to bleed a slight amount of pressure to counteract the fact that the tire contact patch is decreasing because there's less downward pressure. So that's aero bleed. So that's going to be dictated based on how quickly you're decelerating and how much downforce you're losing on the car. You'll notice that if you're in a straight line and you brake really hard, if initially it stops well, but you hold constant pressure and then you eventually, before you even turn in, you get some micro lockups, That's because you haven't bled enough pressure off because the downforce level is decreasing. The contact patch of the tire is also decreasing. Therefore, you're losing grip and adhesion with the surface of the road. So that's when you're going to start to need to have a slight aero bleed before you have the mechanical bleed off point, which is your turn-in point. So that's dictated based on the roll in the car and when you have an imbalance between the left and right side tires. As soon as you start to turn in, the inside tires will actually unload with the weight of the car. Therefore, it's going to pull the tire up off the ground because the weight is getting lighter on the inside. Therefore, the contact patch of the tire is decreasing. So there's actually a trade-off between the turn-in and the braking. You need to start giving up some braking as you start adding some turning in to balance out where the weight's going on the car so you avoid the lockups, either in a car with no ABS or to get into that ABS, which then adds a few other problems. You get overheating of the tires because the brakes are pulsing. You end up understeering off and missing your corner, and you basically lose precision. So really pay attention to when you need to get off the brake, and if you feel like you still need to hold the brake pressure on in order to slow the car down for when you want to turn in, it comes back to stage number 1. That's your brake point. Move it backwards and start looking at stage number 2. Have you been efficient with the way you ramp the pedal up? Have you decelerated the car to the best of its ability? You really have to start looking back up through the stages to know if you've made a mistake along the way, to avoid making that terrible mistake of having too much brake pressure on or not being in control at the point that you want to start to turn in and shape the corner. Stage 4 is the rate of release. Now, the rate of release, what does that mean? It's how quick you come off the brake. So from your peak pressure, you may have some aerodynamic bleed off. I'm talking about the mechanical bleed off, the mechanical release point for when you turn in. So that's actually pretty simple. The bleed off, or the rate of release on the bleed off, is going to be dictated by how quickly you rotate the steering wheel. Is it a sharper corner? Is it a more open, fast sweeping corner? If it's a sweeping corner, then you'll have a slower bleed off because you're adding the wheel nice and slow because it's a big, long radius corner. If it's a tight hairpin turn, the bleed off is going to be quite quick because you're adding a lot of wheel in a very short amount of distance. So you're asking the car to rotate really quickly. Now, if you have too much brake pressure, you're basically just going to understeer off or lock up the inside wheel because you actually shift the weight really, really quickly based on how quickly you rotate the wheel in. So it's all dependent on how quick you rotate your steering wheel into a corner and based on what the type of corner you're approaching is. Like I said, hairpin, really quick rate of release. So you're coming off the brake as you rotate the wheel in. If it's a fast sweeping corner, chances are you're going to have less peak pressure because you don't want to kill the speed off too early. You'll have a much lower peak pressure and a much slower rate of release off as you rotate the wheel gently. Now, the rate of release can also impact, like I mentioned, your car balance. If you feel like the car is really pointy as well, and it doesn't matter on the shape of the corner, if it's really pointy and you feel like you have an oversteering balance, the last thing you want is weight on the front axle or the front 2 tires. You want to try to shift the weight balance of the car and the contact patch a little more rearward, which is going to help balance out your car. Because ultimately, like I said, the contact patch of the tires, that's what dictates the balance of the car. So if you feel like the car is oversteering on the entry and you're losing the back of the car, try to get that weight off the front and shift it rearward a bit earlier so your rate of release will be a bit quicker. Now, if you have too much understeer, then your rate of release will be a bit slower because you need that weight still over the front tire. So that's something you can start to play with as you get more experience with these techniques, and you can really play with the balance of your car to achieve the maximum rate of rotation if you need it, or to calm the rear of the car down if you're over rotating into a corner. The final stage of braking, stage 5, is arguably the most important. This is the part that makes you a great driver rather than just a good driver. This is called the 0% pressure point. And that's when you come fully off the brake. So again, this is going to be based on balance of the car. If you need the front end, then you're going to stretch out that braking as long as possible with a very, very low amount of pressure. That's not necessarily slowing you down, but it is putting a small percentage of weight on the front tires if you need that extra rotation. Now, if you don't need the rotation and the car is carving the entry of the corner very well, then you can actually get off the brake and coast a little bit and just roll with a neutral car into the corner. Generally, what I see as a mistake is that people drop the pressure. They go to 0% brake pressure too soon, typically, and they lose the feeling of the front end. Now, a good way for you to experience this and to understand what I mean by the 0% pressure or 0% brake pressure point is to go to, if you're on iRacing or a skid pad, you can try the centripetal circuit. It's just a big circle. Now, you can drive around in a circle, and what you can practice doing is driving at a constant speed with a constant steering input. Just drive around in a circle, and what you're going to do is just lift off the throttle, and you're going to see what the effect does. Don't change your steering position, just lift off the throttle. What you'll see is that the radius decreases. It gets tighter and tighter and tighter. Now, the same thing comes into effect when you're braking, but it's amplified. So when you lift off throttle, essentially it's acting as a deceleration force because you're getting slower. There's no acceleration force being applied to the car. Therefore, the drag from the road, the wind, it's going to slow you down naturally, and all the weight shifts forward. Now, if you just brush the brake with a few percent, and all it takes is about between, let's say, 2 to 10%, that's enough brake pressure where it's just going to set the weight over the front axle. And depending on the car, every car is a little bit different, but you'll be able to see how much of an effect it has on the car. Again, keeping your hands exactly the same. Don't change the steering input. Keep it at a constant. All you're going to do is lift off and give it a little bit of brake pressure. Start with 5% brake pressure and see how that radius tightens massively. So it has a huge effect. And imagine you apply that to a corner on a track. You'll really start to master the balance of your car. And that last little bit is what allows you to stretch out the speed that you carry into the corner. You can bring it further along into the apex of the corner while maintaining a great balance on the car. These are my 5 stages of the brake zone. I hope you guys really enjoyed breaking down braking. Hopefully this helps you in some way, shape, or form improve on track, get more confidence, gain consistency, and ultimately what I would love is to hear if it's improved your lap time.